Zaczynamy od spojrzenia na to, co dzieje się na świecie, na dojrzałych rynkach i mamy to szczęście, że jest z nami dzisiaj Alan McGill, który jest zaangażowany w wiele globalnych projektów, także na przykład w tych związanych z obecną finalizacją wskaźników, to w jaki sposób będziemy raportować na świecie, co przyjmą regulatorzy jako obowiązujące standardy, ale też ma doświadczenie z wielu projektów, gdzie z dużymi organizacjami pomaga im w dostosowaniu ich biznesów i też właśnie raportowania do tych nowych wymogów. Także Alan, the floor is yours.
Good morning and welcome to all of you around this issue of ESG. Really important project, but one that has increasingly become important for all organizations to think about. What I would like to do this morning with you is to go through a few of the trends that I am seeing in the ESG market space and to talk about the relevance, the importance, and some of the steps that organizations are now taking to start reporting around their ESG metrics and what it is that they are actually doing. With that, there'll be a focus around why now. Why is it that ESG has suddenly become a very topical issue, debated by many, many different types of organizations and also different parts of civil society? Look at a few of the regulatory trends around what companies are now being asked to report on, and some of the reporting trends where companies are now starting to respond to those issues and to those needs. As was outlined, there will be an opportunity for a question and answer session as well at the end, but also towards the very end of the presentation this morning also. So why is there an increasing focus? Why now? What's changed? It's clear to see from this information here that you can see that there are many different organizations and many different people who are now looking at the ESG agenda and specifically the issue of climate change. Those of you may recognize Mark Carney there, picture in the top left-hand corner, previous governor of the Bank of England, who established a task force to specifically look at the issue of climate change, creating something called the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or TCFD. This is where there was a need, as Mark saw, to basically provide investors, providers of capital, with information about climate change and the way that climate change was going to impact that business or that organization. You're seeing regulators starting to require additional reporting now. So in the center there's extracts around what the UK regulator is doing. They have now mandated for UK companies to start reporting and using the TCFD framework. You're seeing civil society engage much more in this subject matter. In the bottom left-hand corner, you have Extinction Rebellion now essentially mobilizing huge parts of civil society to think and to get them to think much more closely about why climate change is a real issue for companies to deal with. And finally, you see financial institutions and other businesses now seeing the opportunity that this whole climate change debate is now making. So it's a real opportunity to drive your business forward, to think about the ways in which you can innovate, develop new products, new services, market, and so therefore it's really important. Climate change is not the only issue on the environmental agenda. There are a few points made here around other issues that are often now starting to be talked about, whether it's around other environmental issues, around health and safety of working conditions for staff, and obviously supply chain, whether it's around anti-bribery and corruption. Many other issues are also affected, which companies are now increasingly starting to report on. The social side is also, I think, as a result of COVID, being significantly dialed up in terms of its importance and relevance. You can see that around Black Lives Matter, equal pay, and lots of issues around the human capital agenda, around the new jobs, new skills, and transitions that businesses are going to go through in relation to their operations. As a result of that, certainly in the UK and in other parts of Europe, you're now starting to see increased disclosures around governance on what they're doing around ESG considerations. You will notice there in almost the center of the slide, issues where the World Economic Forum have now established some principles around effective climate governance. Boards should start to engage with the subject matter. And therefore, again, you can see the increased disclosures that are starting to be made. What you're also seeing, and this slide starts to show as to why investors are now critically starting to engage with this subject matter. 2 points that I would raise from this slide very quickly, just to share with you and to illustrate this. The first is in the middle box on the left-hand side. Hopefully you can read and see, but it basically talks there about organizations getting access to cheaper capital, cheaper finance to fund their operation, if they have a good understanding of ESG and environmental and climate risks associated with their business. And they're able to demonstrate that understanding through the way in which they present their reporting, but also the way in which they engage with those providers of finance. And indeed, investors in the bottom left-hand corner box, BlackRock, the world's largest fund manager, this year alone has now voted 53 times against management and board in relation to, as they see it, a lack of adequacy around an understanding of the ESG agenda. So when your investors start voting against management and against board in terms of confidence in them, that starts to send, I think, real important messages into the marketplace about why a company should start to engage with this area and what they need to do around it. Why are we seeing that, and why are investors interested? Well, these graphs show that for those organizations who do engage in the ESG agenda, do tend to outperform the market. They outperform in terms of share price performance, and as a result of that, equally, they tend to basically deliver better, more profit, and a more resilient organization in terms of their overall business model. So it's very clear to investors as to why they're now starting to engage with this information, because they can really see that if the company understands these issues, then actually they have a better chance of positioning the company for the future with the right products, the right services, and therefore on that basis, the ability to actually generate continued financial returns, as well as aligning that with good socially and environmentally responsible operations of the business. So really important now for investors, but also other parts of civil society. The next issue is around the changing tastes of consumers. So whilst investors are really interested, consumers are becoming increasingly interested here. The chart there from Google Trends shows how companies are basically starting to now look at this particular issue, and it's really starting to change buying habits by consumers. We're also seeing that through that change and through those drives from consumers, that they want to start investing in companies that are more socially and environmentally responsible. So looking at and seeing here the slides around assets under management, we're seeing a huge trend and increase towards those assets and companies that can demonstrate how ESG is a really important issue for them. And now there are assets under management nearly totaling 86 trillion in terms of actually those companies that are engaging with ESG. We're also seeing all financial institutions provide increased amounts of green or sort of ESG financing. This chart shows almost 100% increase in 2019 in relation to the amount of money that institutions have provided to businesses who can demonstrate what it is that they are doing. And again, BlackRock has indicated that ESG has now become the new standard for investing and is looking at the performance associated with a company's operations. You're seeing linked bonds come into place now, so new financial instruments being developed. An example here of Chanel, who recently, a couple of months ago, raised 600 million euros by linking the decarbonisation and their desire to become carbon neutral to the finance that they're raising. So again, significant issues that are moving forward here for organisations. And indeed, the Green New Action Plan across Europe has Europe moving towards essentially a carbon neutral position by 2050. So increased regulation, increased reporting disclosures are absolutely going to come through from an EU perspective on all organisations. And therefore, you are going to see how companies start to respond to this through their reporting. The EU Action Plan at the moment focuses on climate change and climate change adaptation, the two issues on the left-hand side of the slide. But it plans to expand out to 4 other environmental areas, but also pick up again on social and governance issues. The EU Green Taxonomy is going to essentially develop that and bring through further reporting requirements to be placed on organisations. That means that businesses need to start producing more information. They need to become more transparent. There is a need to fill that information gap. And we're certainly starting to see organisations do that as they come through. That information is starting to inform different investors and different organisations about some of the risks their business face. CDP, the Carbon Disclosure Project, shows that the largest 215 companies in the world have over $1 trillion of value at risk associated with climate change, not in the next 10, 15, 20 years, but within the next 5. This shows that this issue is real, it's now, and it's relevant to all businesses to be able to report on. Lots of information as well around what press are now starting to write about companies in relation to their organisation, their pension funds, and regulation. So what are some of those regulatory trends? We're seeing the TCFD, as I mentioned, starting to come in, a real need to understand what the impact is of climate change on the business, doing that through physical and transition risks, as well as understanding what the impact is that you're having on the environment, but doing this in relation to products, customers, operations, supply chain. The TCFD, the overview very quickly of it, for those of you who may not be familiar with it, it essentially has 4 key areas: governance, strategy, risk management, metrics, targets, and a number of disclosures that are required to be put underneath. Many businesses are now already engaging with those disclosures and starting to report on them in relation to what they are doing and where they're going for their reporting already. This graph here shows that basically you have got increasing amounts of disclosures, as I've just mentioned, typically around all areas. But one area that's really very difficult for many companies to engage with is the issue of the scenario analysis. This is where companies are being asked to think about their operations in the future, how climate change is going to impact them, and therefore think about those financial consequences in today's terms of those impacts and of those implications. So absolutely seeing how businesses are needing to respond, the sort of strategies that they're putting in place, the information that they're using to help drive their business forward. So what are we seeing? There are a number of trends in place. A review of the FTSE 100 here in the UK has shown that management is definitely engaging from a governance perspective, but skills and training is lacking, where people perhaps don't have a full appreciation of an understanding. So you can see there from some of the donuts that there's 17% in the middle where boards are needing to train and get upskilled in relation to their understanding of climate change. Many organisations, though, starting to think about their strategy, development of net zero strategies that are now being disclosed and information coming through much more clearly in that reporting. And also across risk management and metrics and targets. I don't intend to go through every single one of these donuts, but for me, it's also interesting to see that essentially when you look at the targets at the moment, about 33% of them down there on the bottom, on the right-hand side, 33% of the targets are now linked to either net zero or science-based targets for organisations. So a lot to do and a lot to think about in terms of that reporting. Also seeing new frameworks being established. The World Economic Forum have come out. They brought out their new principles for governance, planet, people and prosperity in relation to the sort of information, again, that they're expecting their members to report on. This is starting to feed a coalition around the reporting agenda and the sort of KPIs and information that companies should be reporting on. So clear indication, again, that there is lots of information being requested by businesses and the need to engage with it. These next few slides just show a few of the disclosures that are starting to come through, whether it's around that governance reporting, here by a company, Burberry in the UK, in terms of how they link everything in, around the strategy, linking that strategy of climate change actually to the business, the operations. Example here from Rio Tinto talking about its different divisions and the way in which it reports that information. Also here, risk management, so talking about those physical, those transition risks that affect companies, the way in which they're starting to be mitigated, looked at, understood, and managed. And you're also seeing at the same time an issue that basically has essentially a whole load of new information being disclosed in relation to what's going on in the marketplace. And as a result of that, you're seeing information come through in relation to carbon emissions and reporting, and on that basis, what businesses are doing, again, to show how they're managing that risk. So with that, I'd just like to thank for the presentation. Very happy to take a few questions now that people may have. I fully appreciate that that was a very quick canter. There's a lot of information that's just been presented there. Hopefully an opportunity for you to engage in a few questions.
You mentioned about the narrower standards and the works of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. And do you think it will impact it anyhow the European Union standards and regulations?
Yes, so I do think that the TCFD is going to have an impact in relation to European standards. There are two countries in the world, the UK and New Zealand, where they've already introduced mandatory TCFD reporting. The timeframes for that are varied in relation to 2021 through to 2025 in the UK and 2023 for New Zealand. I do believe that the adoption of TCFD in other European jurisdictions will likely come into effect. And I think it will definitely have an influence on the non-financial reporting directive and the consultation that was just being mentioned and discussed when that is released in broadly the first quarter of next year. There are other frameworks that are also now encouraging the adoption of the TCFD framework. If you look at the recent World Economic Forum and a paper that they released in relation to metrics that they are reporting on and asking organizations to report, under the climate pillar, TCFD is a requirement for them to disclose and report to the KPIs and metrics. So I do see that TCFD is going to have an influence. It is something that I think will become more and more commonplace. And as a result of that, I do expect EU and other, the individual sovereign countries within the EU to adopt reporting around this.
Thank you.